The goblins earned their voice. Once upon a time, in the deep and ancient forest, the crafty goblin spied on the secret keeper as she made her rounds, gathering up secrets that the animals of the forest had for sale. "How," said the first goblin, "does she get the people's secrets? Do you suppose she peels open their heads?" "Let's find out," said the second. And so the goblins watched the secret keeper. They watched her until the stalwart moose came to her, head hanging low. "It was my fault. I chose the uneven trail. I can't bear to remember." The secret keeper nodded and gazed into the stalwart moose's eyes. Though the goblins couldn't hear anything, they knew she was speaking to the moose, for the secret keeper spoke in people's minds with the gift of the voice. After a few minutes, the stalwart moose blinked. "I feel lighter," said the moose. "Did I just give you something?" The secret keeper nodded, handing him a coin. The stalwart moose nodded and plodded along down the trail. He spied the goblins hiding in the woods and narrowed his eyes, for he knew the goblins were often to mischief. The two goblins whistled endlessly, and the moose was forced to carry on, because they were not doing anything obviously bad. "I need to know what the secret was," said one of the goblins. "Let's go buy it." So the goblins approached the secret keeper before she could stow away the moose's secret. "We want to buy the moose's secret. What do you have to trade?" asked the secret keeper, her voice filling their minds. The goblin produced a silver-handled hairbrush they had stolen from the princess, and the secret keeper nodded. And that is how the goblins came to know that the moose's mate has tumbled down a cliffside to her death. The secret keeper moved on. The first of the goblins said, "I want to know more." So the goblins followed the secret keeper, hoping to find where she hid the secrets. They followed her to the peak of a nearby ridge and watched as she stole the rest of the day's secrets high in the cloud. When she had gone, they climbed a high spruce tree that disappeared into the misty sky. They reached out and just managed to dip their hands into the clouds. Their heads were filled with memories, and they snatched their hands back out, as if they had just thrust them in boiling water. Tears poured down their cheeks. That was how the secret keeper found them crying in the tree. "You stole my secrets," shrieked the secret keeper. "Give them back." The crafty goblins stopped crying because they saw an opportunity. "What will you give us in exchange?" they asked. "I will give you back the silver-handled hairbrush," offered the secret keeper. "For so many secrets? Push! You have to offer more than that." "What if," said the secret keeper, "I share the gift of the voice?" The crafty goblins grew excited. "That will do." So the secret keeper shared the gift of the voice with the goblins, and immediately they found they could hear one another's thoughts and feel each other's feelings. The crafty goblins gave back the secrets they had taken and ran back to the big wooden house. There they found the princess preparing food. They tried to peer into her mind, but they found it was blank. They tried to speak to her, using only their own minds, but she could not hear them. It seemed the secret keeper was craftier than the crafty goblins, for she had only shared enough of her power to let the goblins use the gift of voice with each other, and not with the whole of the forest. And that's how the goblins stole the gift of the voice from the secret keeper. But why they could only use it with each other. The big frog is punished. Once upon a time, in an ancient and deep forest, there lived a big frog in a small pond. She was no ordinary frog, for she had been given the gift of speech when she saved the princess from the mad hunter. From morning to evening, she did everything the other frogs did, except that she knew how to speak. Everybody in the forest could hear her loud voice, and everybody was unhappy with that, because she never stopped babbling. She babbled about the too hot sun and the too deep pond, about the rain to come, and all the delicious flies she had eaten. Across the forest, all the creatures tolerated the endless noise, until one day they could not deal with it any more. They asked the big frog to quiet down. "I can't," said the big frog. "This is what I do. Before the princess kissed me, I croak all day long, and you all like that I did. This is the same, except you can understand what I say, and now you find it irritating. But I can't change what I am, can I? Could you?" All the creatures agreed that she was right, and that it was rude of them to ask the big frog to stop doing what she had always done. So they returned to their own parts of the forest and let the big frog do what frogs have always done, jumping and talking some more about the too hot sun and the too deep pond, about the rain to come and the delicious flies they had eaten. And for the time it was all right, but in the forest world, word travels fast and everybody has a story to tell. The big frog, being who she was, gossiped and gossiped about everything she overheard. She told the bees that Old Bear had stolen their precious honeys 2 years ago, and she told the beavers that the eagles had stolen their precious wood. She told the deer who had killed her fawn, and she told the tall spruce who had carved a curse word into its bark. Once again, everybody in the forest asked the big frog to keep quiet, for now everyone had a grudge against everyone else. But once again, the big frog would not listen. When I was just a frog, you never paid attention to me, and nobody helped me with the mad hunter hunting me for sport. This is the only a right for a wrong, and I won't stop talking. The fuss went on, and the noise was so loud that the Ice King himself awoke and decided to see what was going on. "Silence!" bellowed the king, and even the big frog stopped babbling. Once the forest was quiet again, the Ice King patiently listened to what each and every animal in the forest had to say, until finally he made up his mind. "Big Frog, you have abused the gift of speech, for you have only used it to get revenge. Despite knowing that words can be hurtful, you threw them around without caution, and you caused too much trouble." The big frog opened her mouth to protest, but the Ice King raised his finger before she could say another word. "Since you received the gift of speech for a good deed, I will not dare to take it away from you. So here is your punishment. I will tell you the biggest of my secrets. It's a secret so powerful and so dangerous that it will frighten you. But if you ever reveal it to anyone..." The Ice King bent down and whispered such potent words in the big frog's ear, and the poor creature started to tremble. "Now go on about your business, all of you, and try to forget what the big frog told you, for you are all living in the forest, and you have nowhere else to go." And this is how the big frog irritated the Ice King and how she was punished. The Goblins saved the Old Beaver. Once upon a time, in the deep and ancient forest, winter gave way to spring, and the sudden burst of warm air that melted all the snow and all the ice all at once. The river swelled until it could no longer hold all the water in, and then it spilled out to create new rivers in places where no one was expecting them. The whole of the forest went into a panic, looking for shelter from the rising waters. The very old beaver had been working on her dam when one of those new rivers came rushing right at her. She screeched and squealed, but whatever direction she ran, more water appeared. She was caught in the flooding, and though she had once been an excellent swimmer, age has taken its toll, and so the raging water carried off at a speed she couldn't control. "Help!" she called. The crafty goblins had been running back to their cave under the big wooden house when they heard the beaver's cries. "We have to help the beaver," one goblin said. "You go one way and I'll go the other." They ran, keeping in touch with the gift of the voice. Finally, one of them spotted her, twisting and tumbling in the river, but she was on the opposite side of the water, and the goblin could not reach her. "Brother," the sister goblin called out through the gift of the voice, "I see her, but I can't get her. Maybe you can." "I'll try." The goblin guided her brother so that he could hit the river in just the right spots to reach the beaver. The plan worked, and soon the second goblin appeared in just the right spot. "Beaver," he shouted, holding out a branch, "grab a hold of this." The beaver grabbed it, but in her panic, she pulled the goblin in too. "No!" cried his sister. She ran as hard as her legs could go, managing to outpace the river and get ahead of the beaver and her brother. Searching for some means of getting them out, she spied a low-hanging branch. They zipped by it quickly, but if they were fast enough. "Brother," she cried out through the gift, "you're coming up on a low-hanging branch. You'll zip by it quickly, but if you're fast enough." "Got it," said her brother, and then he said to the beaver, "Get ready and grab a hold of the low-hanging branch. We're going to zip by it quickly, but if we're fast enough." Suddenly they were right in front of it and reached out, snagging a hold. Though the water beat against them, trying to shake them loose, they pulled themselves along the branch back to dry land. When they were all safe, the very old beaver thanked the goblins. "But how," she asked, "did you know just where to find me? And how did you know the branch was coming?" The goblins shared a secret smile. "Just lucky, I guess," they said. And that is how the goblins saved the very old beaver from the flooding river, and how she never knew how they did it. The goblins irritate the Ice King. Once upon a time, in a deep and ancient wood, the crafty goblins were getting into all kinds of trouble. They had woken up in a particularly mischievous mood that day, and there was not a single denizen of ancient forest who they did not manage to pull a prank on. They left the mud pie in the princess' kitchen, so that when she dug in, she got a big mouthful of dirt. They used the paint to draw silly pictures all over the moose antlers while he slept. They told the mangy muskrat that his coat had been returned to its former glory, which had him very sad when he rushed to the water's edge and found he was in fact still mangy. They stole the branches from the very Old Beaver's dam in order to have a sword fight, and they filled the old bear's den with birds. Every time they ran away in a fit of giggles, never stopping to consider whether their jokes had done any harm. They were on their way to fill the hideous pelican beak full of bubbles when they were hoisted into the air by their legs. Though they trashed and shouted, they found themselves staring into the face of the Ice King. All morning, he said, I have been hearing complaints about you too. They're just pranks, said the goblins. No one has really been hurt. Oh no? Asked the Ice King. He forced them to see how each of the victims of their pranks was doing. The princess had a stomachache from swallowing the mud. The moose antlers itched terribly where the paint had touched them. The muskrat was crying, sad at being reminded that his vanity had cost him. The very Old Beaver den was flooded, and the old bear was trying to get birds out of his fur, but finding most of them hopelessly tangled. For your punishment, said the Ice King, you must help each of them undo the harm you caused. If you do the good enough job of this, there will be no farther punishment. If you do not, you will have to give me your noses so that you can no longer stick them in other people's business. Now the goblin liked their noses right where they were in the middle of their faces, so they set about making things right. They baked a real pie for the princess and brewed her a tea that would settle her stomach. They scrubbed the moose antlers clean and covered them in soothing mud. They sat by the river with the muskrat, listening as he talked in great detail about his old coat, and then they did their best to point out all the things that were still handsome about him, like his proud whiskers and sparkling eyes. They let the very Old Beaver rest while they repaired all the damage done to her den, and then finally they removed every burr from the old bear fur, even the ones that were hopelessly tangled. In the end, it came before the Ice King to see if they had done enough. The Ice King surveyed the forest and found that everyone seemed to be back to normal. What did you learn? Asked the Ice King. That our pranks can make people feel bad, said the goblins. The Ice King smiled and nodded. Yes, actions have consequences. In case you forget, I'm going to leave you a reminder. Whenever one of your pranks is going to hurt someone, you're going to feel a little pit in your stomach. That will be your punishment and your warning. So every time after that, the goblins set out to do a prank that went a little too far. They felt a little pit in their stomachs, and they were forced to consider whether it was the right thing to do. And that's how the goblins irritated the Ice King and how they were punished. The Pelican Forgives the Goblins. Once upon a time in the deep and ancient forest, there lived a pair of crafty goblins in a cave below the big wooden house. They lived with the white princess, who shared as much food with them as she was able, but it was never quite enough. This left the goblins hungry, very hungry, always hungry. One day, as they were out foraging for food, the hideous pelican landed on the rock. It dumped a smorgasbord from her beak, which the goblins knew was magic and never emptied. There was king crabs in red, blue, gold, and scarlet, veiny blue shrimp, pink shell scallops, oblong brown clams, purple spiny urchins, and even one prickly red sea cucumber. The food just kept coming. They watched as the pelican ate one clam and then took a nap. Do you think she would mind if we took just a little? Asked the one goblin to the other. Her beak never emptying, she won't possibly miss a couple of crabs, said the second, licking her lips. They were agreed, and they crept over, flinched some crabs, and ran. The goblins scarfed the crabs, but when they finished, they found that they were very still hungry. She won't miss a handful of shrimp, said the one goblin to the other. The goblins scarfed the shrimp, but when they finished, they found that they were still hungry. Maybe also a few scallops, said the one goblin to the other. The goblins scarfed the scallops, but when they were finished, they found that they were still hungry, so they went back for clams, and then the urchins, and finally even the sea cucumber. Finally, they were not hungry, but there was nothing left. Just then the pelican woke up. What happened to my food? She asked. Unable to lie about it, the goblins confessed their crime. The pelican was dismayed, but she was a terrible-hearted bird, and she could tell the crafty goblins were growing little creatures. "Goblins," said the piteous pelican, "I will share my food with you, but you must, in return, follow my example and be generous with others as I am with you. Take that to heart, and I will consider your debt paid." "But we have nothing to give," said the goblins. "You have your nimble hands and your crafty brains and your loving heart," said the pelican. The crafty goblins realized how much they had to give, and for the rest of the day they looked for ways to help other creatures of the forest. They found the stalwart moose struggling with an itchy, hard-to-reach spot on its back, and so they climbed up and gave it a good scratching. Next they helped the old bear, who could not get the honey out of a narrow beehive. They climbed up to the top of the tree with the hive and then dropped it, cracking it open. Finally they found the princess crying over the loss she could not speak about, so they wrapped their little arms around her in a great big hug and stayed until she felt better. When they were done, they returned to the piteous pelican. "Did it feel good being as generous as I am?" asked the pelican. "It did," said the goblins. "I am glad," said the pelican. We all have problems that we can't solve on our own, but if everyone goes about with generosity in their hearts, then there is always someone on hand to help. But we will all must commit to do so, or there may be no one there to help you when you need it." This made sense to the goblins, and they thanked the piteous pelican for her food and the lesson. Of course, by this time they were hungry again, and that remained an ongoing problem until the day the stalwart moose taught them to fish. But that is another story. And that is how the piteous pelican forgave the crafty goblins and how she taught them charity. Gosh, I'm thirsty. The goblins meet the ice troll. Once upon a time, in an ancient and deep forest, the crafty goblins were awake long after they should have been asleep. One goblin said to the other, "Let's go explore the forest." Now the goblins were not in the habit of exploring the forest late at night, and they did not know what they would find, but it did not scare them off. They crept out of their beds, bundled up, and went exploring. It was dark. The light of the moon was just enough to keep them from walking into the trees, but they could not see more than 15 feet in front of them. Every time a twig snapped or a branch rattled, they considered turning back, but they didn't. And so they ventured far beyond the house into a part of the forest they were not familiar with. When they realized the snapping of twigs and the rattling of branches had become steady, something was following them. They turned to run, but a hulking figure emerged from the darkness, sweeping them up with a giant hand and stuffing them in a burlap sack. The goblins wiggled and cried out, but the sack remained shut as their captor stomped through the forest singing, "Whittle diddle diddle dum, whittle diddle dee, and this bag a meal for me." After a lot of thumping and tugging, the bag opened, and the goblins were dumped into a giant iron pot full of warming water. A huge troll stood overhead, grinning down at them through a long bushy white eyebrows. "I am the ice troll, and you are my dinner." He ready to cook the goblins, singing, "Whittle diddle dum, dum dee dee, there'll soon be a soup for me." Finishing his diddly, he bent over to stroke the fire beneath the pot and let out a loud noise of pain, rubbing a spot on his back that always ached. The troll stood painfully and walked over to the stone shelf, where he began to chop potatoes. One of the goblins had an idea. She whispered to her brother, "Follow my lead." The goblin stretched out into the water, floating and letting out sighs of contentment. "Oh," said one of the goblins, "this is the most relaxed I've ever been. My body feels so good I think I could run 100 miles without stopping," said the second. The troll peered at them. They weren't supposed to be happy about being in the cook pot, but they certainly looked like they were. "Troll," said Goblins, "if your back is hurting, you should try sitting in the water, just for a little bit, before it gets too hot." The troll stomped over, "But if I take you out, then you will escape, and there will be no soup for me." "Put us back in the sack," suggested the goblins, "then we can't run away." This made sense to the troll. The spot on his back that always ached was still bothering him, and the goblins couldn't go anywhere if they were trapped. So he stuffed the goblins back into the sack and climbed into the soup pot. He stretched out and let out a sigh of contentment. Meanwhile, the goblins threw themselves around in the sack until it began to swing. The troll was so relaxed he didn't even notice. The bag dropped onto the shelf where the troll had been chopping potatoes, and the goblins pushed it up against the edge of the troll's knife, sawing a hole. Then they made a break for it. The troll finally noticed that what they were doing and roared out in anger, but he was so relaxed that when he tried to chase them, he tumbled out of the cook pot and into the flames, catching his bushy eyebrows on fire. The goblins ran and ran and ran and ran as fast as they could through the ancient and deep forest until they were back in the cave and safe in their beds. They vowed never to venture out of the ancient and deep forest late at night again, for they did not think they would get so lucky as to trick the ice troll twice. And that is the story how crafty goblins met the ice troll, and why they never did again. Scary. The goblins tricked the muskrat. Once upon a time, in a deep and ancient wood, there lived a muskrat. The muskrat was a lazy, cowardly creature who did little but laid around in the sun, cleaning his beautiful coat until it shone. One day, the muskrat found the crafty goblins playing King of the Mountain on his favorite rock. He was too cowardly to confront them directly, so he retreated to the safe distance and then pitched a stone right at a hornet's nest hanging overhead. One of the goblins saw him do it, but before she could say anything, the hornets emerged, furious, and chased the goblins away, stinging them. With the rock empty, the muskrat claimed his spot. When the goblins returned, they asked the muskrat, "Why did you do that?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, turning away to ignore them. The goblins knew that the muskrat cared for nothing but his coat, so they devised to steal it in order to teach him a lesson. As the muskrat laid in the sun, he spied the goblins strutting by. Their skin was covered in flecks of gold. "Goblins," called the muskrat, "what happened to make your skin shine that way?" "When we were attacked by the hornets, we ran and ran until we found a pool by a glacier. We dove in and then came out this way." "Would you show me this pool?" asked the muskrat. The crafty goblins led the muskrat to the pool. The muskrat looked at the pool skeptically. "It just looks like a pool," he said. The goblins chuckled and shrugged. "You don't have to jump in if you don't want to, but what do you lose if you try? And if it works, why, you will be the most beautiful creature in the whole forest." With visions of his splendid coat in mind, the muskrat jumped in. When he was emerged, he was disappointed to find that nothing had changed. Said one goblin. "Maybe you have to be stung by hornets first, just like us." The muskrat hesitated, because being stung would be painful. Seeing his hesitation, the goblin added, "If it works, you would be the most beautiful creature in the whole of the forest." The muskrat decided it was worth it, so he returned to the hornet's nest and pitched a stone right at it. The hornets emerged even more furious this time. They chased the muskrat, stinging him repeatedly until he jumped into the magic pool. The muskrat was disappointed to find that once again nothing had changed. "I wonder if the magic only works for us," said one of the goblins. "Would you like me to jump in with your coat?" The muskrat hesitated. "If it works, you will be the most beautiful creature in the whole of the forest." With visions of this splendid coat in mind, the muskrat agreed. He slipped it off and handed it to the goblins. Without his coat, the muskrat was pale and covered in scabby welts. Instead of jumping in the pool, one of the goblins ran away with the coat, laughing. The other pushed the muskrat into the frigid pool, and as the water splashed the goblin, the gold flecks ran, revealing that they had only ever been painted on. The muskrat cried so pitifully and made such a clamor that he awoke the Ice King. They came down to the forest to see what had happened. When the Ice King saw the muskrat, he laughed, only furthering infuriating the creature. "Tell me what happened," said the Ice King. Both the muskrat and the goblins told their sides of the story, and then the Ice King considered the case before him. "It is true that the muskrat is vain, and he thinks of nothing but himself," concluded the Ice King. "But he needs something to keep him warm in the water and snow." So the Ice King was decided. The muskrat would get his coat back, but it would be patchy and unkept. After that day, he became known as the mangy muskrat. And that's how the goblins tricked the muskrat into giving up his coat and how he got his name. Yikes. I'll be right back. Okay. The moose teaches the goblins. Once upon a time in a deep and ancient forest, the crafty goblins were hungry. This wasn't unusual. The goblins were always hungry, but today they were particularly hungry. They opened the wise princess cupboards to look for a snack, but all she had was a small pile of nuts and berries and just one strip of dry fish. The goblins grabbed it all and gobbled it up, but they were still hungry. They went out in the woods to look for more to eat. First they dropped by the small pond. The big frog was asleep, and beside the pond was a pile of insects she had caught for eating after she woke up. The goblins crept up to the pile and carefully, not to wake the big frog, they got close. She ribbered loudly and they froze, but as the big frog kept sleeping, so they grabbed at the pile of insects and gobbled it up. But they were still hungry. As they crept back into the woods, they found the stalwart moose watching them. "Did you just steal the big frog's food?" The goblins tried not to look guilty, but failed. "She said we could have them," they cried. "Oh, really?" asked the moose. "Let's ask her." So the moose woke up the big frog and asked, "Did you say the goblins could have your food?" The big frog looked at the goblins, who she knew were always hungry, and nodded. "Yes, I did." "Really?" asked the moose, surprised. Frog nodded, and the moose sighed. "All right, then," he said, and had let the goblins go. Their next stop was the river. They watched as the old bear swiped at the leaping salmon, catching it deftly in his large paws. He laid it out upon a rock and left it to dry, lumbering into the woods to seek out some berries. The crafty goblins crept up to the rock carefully in case the old bear returned. They reached the rocks, grabbed the salmon, and gobbled it all up, but they were still hungry. As they crept back into the woods, the stalwart moose was once again waiting for them. "Are you going to tell me the old bear said you can have that?" "Yes," replied the goblins. Old Bear ambled up at that moment, and Moose asked him, "Did you leave that fish for the goblins?" The old bear looked at the goblins, who he knew were always hungry, and nodded. "I did," he said. "Really?" asked the moose. "Really," said the old bear. After the moose left, the old bear said to the goblins, "Be sure to tell the princess I was kind to you, and don't steal my fish again." The goblins, still hungry, went out looking for one more meal. They crept up on the mangy muskrat's lodge and began to climb inside when they were dragged right back out. It was the stalwart moose dangled them by the seats of their pants and said, "Now I know the mangy muskrat didn't tell you that you could eat his food because he blames you for his coat being ruined. Besides, he barely has enough for himself and doesn't share with anyone." The goblins began to protest, but he shook his head. He set the goblins down and said, "Come with me." The goblins followed the stalwart moose to the part of the river where it ran slow enough for them to walk into it safely. He gave them each a fishing line and said, "I am going to teach you to fish, so that when you are hungry, you do not need to steal from the animals of the forest. It will be hard work, but it will be honest." The crafty goblins were not against working hard. They were just hungry, and so they listened to the moose and soon pulled a wiggling fish out of the river. They ate them up, and finally they were no longer hungry. And that is how the stalwart moose came to teach the crafty goblins to fish. The Mad Hunter gets his hand back. Once upon a time, in a deep and cold lake near the ancient forest, there lived an old seal who was a powerful witch. After angering the Ice King, she had been bound to the lake, allowed only to venture out when the moon was full, and only looking like a hag she truly was. For years she dreamed of vengeance, all alone within the deep lake among the corpses of her many previous victims. One night she awoke to see a black and hooded silhouette crawling to reach a beautiful gown full of stone. The human had delved far deeper into the lake than any land dweller could have been able to go. His tenacity and ferociousness impressed the moon hag, and she decided he would be wasted in the sanctuary of her corpses. She used her magic to enspell him, allowing him to breathe underwater, but also binding him to her service. "You," she said, "will be the instrument of my release and my revenge, and for you and I together will kill the Ice King." The moon hag had never heard of the Mad Hunter, and she did not know the power he wielded. She could only tell he was a hunter, and her lust of revenge blinded her to the threat he posed. She gifted him a hand of ice, which was not as nimble as the hand of flesh, but allowed him to serve her better than no hand at all. The moon hag spent years devising a perfect plan to kill the Ice King, and years more moving all the pieces in place to execute it. And in the meantime, the Mad Hunter served her, guarding her chest of treasures and plotting his own plots. Finally, everything was prepared, the full moon rose, and the moon hag stepped on land. Giddy at the thought she would never have to leave again if it did not please her, she brought the mad hunter to his post, a jagged piece of ice and stone from which he could loose an arrow that would slay the Ice King. Before she could go, he put forward a proposal. "Moon hag," said the mad hunter, "if you go back my missing hand, I would be certain to hit the Ice King with my arrow. We will have only one shot, and I would hate to miss. You are a powerful witch, so you will be able to craft ties to bind me to this place that I cannot break." The moon hag considered this. "All right, I will grow back your hand, and then you will bind here with a tie that will not break." She cast the spell, and the moon hunter's hand of ice was replaced with the hand of flesh. As the witch left to complete her next part of the plan, the mad hunter grinned wickedly in the moonlight. After a short time, the moon hag returned, luring the Ice King into the mad hunter's line of sight. What is this about, Moon Hag?" asked the Ice King. "Many a long year have you been bound me to the lake," said Moon Hag. "Many a long year have I been alone in the dark. That ends tonight." She cast a powerful spell that made the Ice King slow to react and gave the signal. "Mad Hunter," she cried, "let your arrow fly." Nothing happened. She twitched nervously. "Mad Hunter," she growled, "let your arrow fly." Still nothing happened. The Ice King, meanwhile, was striding towards her, slow but furious. The moon hag fled, running first to the jagged piece of ice and stone where her servants should have waited. But the peak was empty, the ties had been broken, and the mad hunter was gone. For in the end he was more powerful of the two, especially the one once he had two hands. When the Ice King finally caught the hag, his furious voice could be heard throughout the forest. "For your wickedness you will be eternally bound to the lake. You will no longer be allowed to leave, not even under the full moon." The moon hag was imprisoned in the lake, and she had never again tried to escape. And this is how the mad hunter escaped the moon hag, and how he got his left hand back.